countryside and into the history books. All of which brings us to the present day and the question before our panel. Is the Massachusetts Legislature, that band on the run from 1774, today the preeminent branch of Massachusetts government? If so, how, why, and to what end? To tackle this question, we have assembled our resident historian, Dr. Nat Scheidele, along with veteran legislators, and the inimitable Mike Dean as moderator. The Honorable Paul Broder most recently served as mayor of Melrose, Massachusetts, and previously served with distinction in the Massachusetts House, where he chaired the Committee on Labor and Workforce Development. Dr. John McDonough, the dean of tonight's panel, served in the Massachusetts House from 1985 to 1997 and presently serves as a professor of public health practice at the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Nat Scheidele is president and CEO of Revolutionary Spaces and a former professor of American history at Wellesley College. A graduate of Stanford University, Nat earned his PhD at Princeton and has promised to give us a complete history of the Coercive Acts of 1774 in 5 minutes or less. And last but not least, our moderator, Michael Dean. Mike is a local political journalist of long standing and esteem, having made his way to the helm of Axios Boston by route of GBH News, State House News Service, Master List, and the venerable Dorchester Reporter. Mr. Dean, the ship of state is yours.
Thank you very much. I should have you do all of my introductions. Well, thank you all for being here, and let's give a round of applause for that wonderful role-play game that we had. I'm sure everyone's still stoked about how that turned out, because it looks like we're going to Philadelphia. So we're going to talk a little bit about the past and the present and maybe the future of Massachusetts politics, kind of where it started. Nat, I think you're the man to take us through from 1774 through the Massachusetts Constitution to what we see up on Beacon Hill now. Maybe you could take us from what happened in that post-Tea Party era into the Revolutionary era until John Adams sat down and wrote what he thought should be the proper framing of a state government.
Sure, and I'm going to drop you off in 1780, so you guys can pick it up from there. No, welcome everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be in dialogue with this fantastic panel. My role here really is to provide a little bit of historical context for the discussion, and the inspiration for tonight's program really was recognizing, after we spent a whole year last year commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, that 1774, the year after the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor, was a pivotal year, and we shouldn't forget that. And the story that we tried to communicate when we talked with people about the Tea Party and its significance was that it was really about representation, right? So we have this phrase that our friend James Otis over here coined, that taxation without representation is tyranny, and most Americans think that the story is really about taxation, and that Americans were angry about taxes. But in fact, Bostonians and residents of Massachusetts during the colonial period taxed themselves more heavily than really any other place in the British Empire. They weren't averse to taxes. They were averse to taxes imposed on them by a body in which they had no representation, right? So how does Parliament and the ministry choose to respond to the destruction of the tea and the expense that incurred? They choose to limit representative government in Massachusetts, and not surprisingly, it doesn't go over very well. So, we are going to be talking about what the sort of where the sort of preeminent power sits in our frame of government in Massachusetts today, where is the weight on the side of the legislature, on the side of the executive. It is helpful when we look at this period to realize that there is a long history of thinking about representation and a long practice of being represented in Massachusetts by the time that the Tea Party comes around. So, I'm going to take you all all the way back to 1629 and the first Massachusetts charter, and I'm going to tell you that there's several steps in the story here where the role of the legislature either expands or is in contest with executive power coming out of Britain, and the interplay informs how choices are made during the Revolutionary period and ultimately informs where we land with the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. So think of the first Massachusetts charter as the era of corporate governance. So I hate to break it to those of you who don't know, but the Great and General Court began as a stockholders gathering, and the first delegates to the Great and General Court were essentially the holders of proxy votes given to them by other shareholders in the company, right? Massachusetts was founded as a joint stock company. The stockholders were empowered to elect a governor and a council of assistants in order to manage the affairs of the company. And everybody assumed that the settlers were going to be managed by the governor, and then the company did something unusual. They absconded to North America with the charter in hand and turned all of the male church members in Massachusetts into shareholders who had a voice in the Great and General Court, right? So you have a system that emerges really quickly where each town gets to choose 2 delegates to the court, to the General Court, and they also get to elect the governor and the deputy governor and the Council of Assistants. So that system works great for the colony of Massachusetts, but it works terribly for the empire because it's very hard to organize the affairs of the empire if you have no voice in how affairs are playing out locally. So by the end of the 1600s, Britain is founding colonies, or England is founding colonies with royal governors who represent the interests of the crown, who can be a reliable voice for the affairs of the empire as a whole. And in Massachusetts, this plays out by having the first charter dissolved and a new charter put in place in 1691. There are some substantial changes in that charter, the number one change being that there is now a royal governor in Massachusetts. But I want you all to think of this era, which lasts all the way until 1774 with the Massachusetts Government Act, as the era of the confused council. Truly,
We have that on quite often.
truly, it was confused. So you have the Massachusetts House of Representatives elected by the towns of Massachusetts. You have a royal governor and lieutenant governor appointed by the crown. And then you have the provincial council, which is simultaneously functioning as the upper house of the legislature. It has to concur in all legislation originating in the House. And it is also functioning as the governor's cabinet, as the executive branch of government. And they are, one of my favorite things to do is to read the records of the council because they do not understand what their role is. They are constantly stopping and debating, are we in executive session or are we in legislative session? Because it matters. The secretary of the colony can be there for executive session and not for legislative session. And the reason why it's important is that the council is the primary target for the Massachusetts Government Act, which is the most significant of the Coercive Acts passed to punish Massachusetts for the destruction of the tea in December of 1773. So the Massachusetts Government Act arrives in the hands of a military governor, Governor Gage, who is with us tonight. He was just playing the game earlier. So he arrives with a standing army to enforce the power of the governor as the representative of the crown. But he also arrives with this document which says, henceforth, the previous mechanism for selecting members of the council will no longer be enforced. So the previous method for choosing members of the council was that the House of Representatives chose the council members. And the governor could veto them, but in practice, it happened once or twice, but not very frequently. Now, the Crown has the authority to appoint members of the council. Now, okay, you might say, if it's sitting over here as a piece of executive power, it's not that big a deal, but it's actually also the upper house of the legislature. The House will not be able to move any legislation in opposition to what is emanating out of London without the support of the council as the upper house of the legislature. So in effect, it completely neuters the ability of the House to mobilize resistance and try to solve the problem that Massachusetts residents saw with their place in the British Empire. And they don't like it. And so the House begins organizing with other colonies to mount an intercolonial Congress, the First Continental Congress, to discuss how to respond to this. When Gage gets word of that, he dissolves the legislature. He dissolves the House of Representatives. And that's power that the royal governor holds. And the theory is they'll at some point in the future hold elections and have a new, more friendly House. But in the meantime, the governor's going to govern with the council, and that will be it, right? There will be no representation, in essence, in Massachusetts. And so that gives us the start of the third phase here, which I think you should think of as the era of the wandering legislators. So the House is up in Salem when they get the word that they've been dissolved, and they simply choose not to be dissolved. They continue to meet as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. They have essentially organized themselves as a revolutionary body. The first thing that they do is say that all the funds that were previously raised through taxes and fees and other things that are funding the affairs that are governed by the House of Representatives, now all those receipts are going to come to the Provincial Congress and its officials. They have organized a revolutionary government, right? In the middle of 1774, they begin to wander, because first they're up in Salem, then they're out in Concord, they find their way to Watertown. In 1776, after the British Army has been kicked out of Boston, they decide they're going to come back to their home at the State House, and they send a little committee to measure the room to see if they can all fit, because there's a lot more people now coming to meetings of the Congress than used to come to meetings of the House of Representatives. They can't fit. They have to continue to wander for a time. So that's the situation at the moment of independence. John Adams, influential Bostonian and someone who has a huge influence in American constitutional thought at this moment, he recommends to the First Continental, or rather to the Second Continental Congress at this time, that a resolution be passed requesting that the states all now, with independence, organize their own frames of government, right? And so the states do this at a different pace, depending on where you are. In Massachusetts, they try to organize a new constitution in 1778, and it's rejected by the voters. So this system of the provincial Congress with no governor, with executive power in the hands, actually, of the council, is the form of government that Massachusetts has until the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 is passed. In states that organize their newly independent state governments early in the revolutionary struggle, without fail, they embody the lessons learned in the argument with Britain, right? And the number one lesson is, boy, we do not like the power of the executive. We hate those royal governors. The power of the governor is a problem to our liberties. And so the best example of this is Pennsylvania organizes in 1776 a frame of government that has a single-body legislature, a unicameral legislature, and it has as its executive branch a 12-person body of sort of advisors who will share the work of being the executive, and they elect for a one-year term somebody to serve ceremonially as the sort of commander-in-chief for Pennsylvania. You can imagine the administration of justice is super spotty. There is really very weak executive authority in Pennsylvania. And this is a war, right? You have state governments trying to administer a war effort with weak executives. It doesn't work really well. And so John Adams, as the sort of prime framer of the Massachusetts government, of the Massachusetts Constitution, hitting in a later period of the war, is responding to lessons learned during the war itself with the challenges of a weak executive. And he gives Massachusetts, along with all the other thinkers that are part of the framing of that Constitution that is adopted by the state, a system with a much stronger executive than one might have expected if you looked at the immediate aftermath of the Coercive Acts. And I think it's possible for that to happen because there's an understanding that the bedrock for the system of government is popular sovereignty, right? The people are to be represented in all of the branches, and their power is divided among three different branches of government, and those branches, the purpose of having a strong executive, a strong judiciary, and a strong legislative body is so that they can provide a check on each other's power, right? So that is a lesson that we hopefully all learned about the US Constitution at some point or another, but it's there in the Massachusetts Constitution, which is an important model for the US Constitution. So where I want to leave you is with the vision of John Hancock, our first governor under the new state constitution of Massachusetts, stepping out onto the balcony of the townhouse, the old state house, not as a weak executive with only ceremonial authority, but with true power in the affairs of state. Maybe not something that we would have guessed if we had looked back a decade earlier.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for that. That was excellent. And I go to the other side of our panel here with two former members of the legislature, two former members of the House. And if we were to jump ahead a few centuries, I guess the question is how much of that system, that John Adams, John Hancock system, is still in play? How much have the politics changed? How much have those constitutional balances shifted? Or is it the case that we do still have, essentially what Nat just explained, as a powerful chief executive and a rival in the legislature, so to speak?
Hi everybody, I'm John McDonough. I served in the Massachusetts House between 1985 and 1997, so 13 years, 13 eventful years, but any years you're in are eventful. So the Constitution that John Adams wrote and that became effective I believe it is the oldest surviving Constitution on the planet. So it has been durable. And so the essential structure of an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, which is absolutely reflected in the federal Constitution. The Massachusetts Constitution was not the only, and it was one very important model in terms of what happened in 1789 with the new federal Constitution. And the notion in each case is that the first part, if you look at the federal Constitution, the first part of the Constitution is not the executive branch. The first part of the Constitution is Congress, and that is intentionally because the belief is that Congress actually holds the meaningful power. And it's so powerful that they have to then divide the power in half. They have to have a House of Representatives or a House of Commons looking at Britain, and then they have to have a higher chamber in Massachusetts' case, and in the federal government it's the Senate. And each is elected according to different rhythms, different districts, different arrangements. So in the US government, the members of the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. All 435 of them are up for election every 2 years. Gets a little tiring for them over time. But in the Senate, they have terms that last 6 years, and every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up. So it was structured in a way that sort of recognized that in this design that we've done, it's the legislative branch that is the most powerful, and so they have to be tamed. And so they're tamed by the structure itself, and they're tamed by then an executive branch that has some real authority and power. It's called a lot of times, it's called the separation of powers, and it's really the sharing of powers. It goes back and forth. So the governor proposes a budget at the start of the year for the coming fiscal year that starts July 1. It goes, he hands it to the legislature takes it, it says thank you very much, they throw it in a wastebasket. The House develops their own budget, they come out and they debate it, they go through a lot of stuff, adding their own stuff, and then they hand it to the Senate, and the Senate takes the House budget and throws it in the wastebasket. And then they write their own budget, and they put it together, and then they send it back to the House, and the House throws that in the wastebasket, and it goes back and forth, and then they create a committee of conference, and they come up with one budget. You'll be seeing it, probably should be done in June. In Massachusetts, it almost always happens sometimes in July, after the year has actually started. And then they agree on the budget, they pass it in each side, and then they send the budget to the governor. The governor could veto the whole thing, and the governor never does that. And the governor then has a line item veto where he can take any line item, any section of the budget, and he can veto it, or he can even rewrite it in some way as himself. And then those changes go back, and the House and the Senate have to then override what he did. So you can see, and then that's the budget that they live with for the year. So what you can see there is it's really not so much a separation of powers as it's a sharing of authority, and the process of creating a budget every year, which is always the most important document that any legislative body does on a regular basis. Where's the money coming from? Who has to pay? How much? How often? And then where is the money going? That's the essential authority. So what you see is we've got in some eras, you could say the governor maybe has more authority and power in terms of how he or she, whether he or she does it, they have the authority, sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes the legislature is much more effective in controlling the governor and being in charge and really setting the agenda. And it goes back and forth. One issue is, if you have a legislature that is controlled by Republicans and a Democratic governor, or vice versa, which is what we have most often, then you've got a different kind of relationship if you have a governor and a legislature of the same party, which is what we have now. Then it's much more likely they're going to be more cooperative and less conflictual. But so it's not written which one is the most powerful. It is subject to the structures, it's subject to the context of the times, and it's subject to the nature of the individuals and how they choose to try to act as governor and use their authority.
Now, Mayor Broder, you were in the House, you served with Governor Patrick and Governor Baker. You've observed Governor Healy. Tell us a little bit, and then serving as an executive in your own role in Melrose, tell us a little bit about the executive attitude, the executive pitch to lawmakers. How much does those characters matter? How much does the approach the governor brings when dealing with legislature really matter towards what gets done?
Well, I want to thank, before we get going, I want to thank Revolutionary Spaces for hosting us and putting in this amazing building. I also want to recognize someone who came into the legislature with me, David Vieira. He's still sticking it out. I believe Falmouth. Am I right? I still remember that. That's pretty good. I do note that I'm sitting between two PhDs. One who I think got his PhD while he was in the legislature. He got that. I got mayor, so you know he's the smartest person in the room here. The cute answer is analogizing mayor to governor is a little bit flawed, is the flip answer as well. Yeah. I'm right, and I have to figure out a way to bulldoze the city council. That is not the way it works. In fact, and there's, the analogy is somewhat flawed because most mayors in Massachusetts work with a city council that is quite small. Now, Melrose was actually kind of large in that it had 11 people for a population of 29,000. You also know each other on a much more, to a certain degree, personal level, so that drives a lot of the dynamic, but it's interesting, in Melrose, in particular, on paper, the city council is a little bit more powerful than it would be in other places because everything of significance that, ordinance changes and such, unless there is a specific provision of state law that would change this, like with some of the new zoning reforms, has to be a supermajority. And a veto, were I to exercise it, would also require that supermajority. So that essentially makes the veto meaningless as a push, right? Because, am I going to veto something that passes with a veto-proof majority? I mean, I suppose it happens infrequently in state government, but that is certainly a dynamic. But I think, John, to a certain, hit the nail on the head in this sense that it is very much a confluence of the rules of the game, the Constitution and such, and the personalities and the dynamics of the folks that are in leadership. As a former House guy, I will tell you, I would say from my time observing and participating in the legislature, that the most important dynamic, be it Governor Patrick or Governor Baker, was far more House versus Senate than Democrat versus Republican or executive versus legislative. And you see that in any number of ways. Sometimes folks will wonder why a certain thing maybe gets hung up in conference. John mentioned conference as a way that a lot of issues between the House and Senate get settled. So you'll take something like, I'm trying to think of something non-controversial, and there isn't really much these days that's not controversial. But
They don't do the non-controversial stuff anymore.
right, so let's
When I was there, we always had high school classes that would sponsor bills to name this or that the official this or that of the Commonwealth. So we had one conference one time where some high school kids tried to declare the cranberry muffin the official muffin of the Commonwealth, and they thought it would be non-controversial.
the blueberry lobby showed up.
No. The corn. No, they wanted the corn muffin.
Okay.
And then they ran into the cranberry industry. Another folks wanted to name the Toll House cookie as the official cookie of the Commonwealth.
That was my
and
school.
They thought that was
as a way of disclosure.
But then they ran headlong into the forces of the fig Newton. And so even things that you think are not controversial can end up being quite controversial.
What you just said, though, about the tension being between the House and the Senate, is that evidence or even proof that that is where the power really lies? The fact that maybe it is a weak executive, the executive can really just delay things with their veto power. The legislature is going to get their way in the end. Therefore, they should be fighting over what the ultimate legislative move is.
If the legislature can hold, right? And that's what I mean. Some of it is personality and leadership style, where you have to have that. I don't know if gravitas is the right word. And there are different ways to measure it. Some people suggest that the leadership structure is such that it is very difficult for rank and file members to have influence because of the perks that the leadership can dole out. That is certainly, I think that's a factor. It's a factor for certainly for some more than others, but that certainly leads to, again, that combination of that plus the structure. One of the most important things that the government does is raises, cuts, lowers taxes, does tax policy. That has to start in the House. And that gives the House a tremendous amount of leverage, not just around that, but potentially around other things that, back to the example that I was struggling to figure out. So you have a dynamic between the House and the Senate, the spending bill. maybe the difference is $100 million, I think most people would go, all right, well, split the difference. You know, you go to 50 million, everyone's happy. But that kind of oversimplifies things, because the way the dynamic works is there are other bills out there that the Senate and House have differing passions about. So if something is very important to, say, the Senate president, the House recognizes that and might hedge, or they might have a whole different issue that they're concerned about, say like a mental health bill versus a criminal justice bill. That all goes into the mix, and I think that can be very confusing, or if you don't see it from the inside, which does lead to some cynicism sometimes. That dynamic, and that's something that the executive is, I don't want to say held hostage to, but that matters because they might have Governor Healy right now has a very significant housing bill. Now, that considered on the merits certainly is one piece of the debate, but that could easily kind of mushroom into a debate about tax policy, environmental policy, whatever the case may be. And that can be very, very challenging for any executive, Democrat or Republican, to have to deal with.
So it's absolutely true that the atom structure still predominates in terms of the overall vibes, and that there's been a continuity for how many hundreds of years, whatever. That doesn't lessen the impact of some other big changes that have happened along the way. And I'd just like to mention one of them that was enormous way back in the 1970s.
Oh, yeah.
So right now, the Senate has 40 members, and the House has 160. Prior to 1978, there were 240 members in the House. And in the 1960s, a group that you don't hear about a lot these days, the League of Women Voters, decided that Massachusetts was a cesspool of corruption, and the whole place needed to be turned upside down. And their solution was, let's cut the size of the House from 240 to 160. The only way they could do that was by getting the voters to approve a constitutional amendment, because it was written into the state constitution that there's 240 seats. It was hard to manage 240. It's tough to manage 160. It's even harder to manage 240. And plus, everybody's looking at the 240, we're looking at each other and saying, okay, one of the three of us ain't gonna be here if this goes through. But a constitutional amendment, before it can go before the people, has to be voted on and passed in what they call a constitutional convention, which is when the House and the Senate, the only time they do it, they get together and vote as a single body. So in those days, it would be 280. I don't know how you fit 280 in the House chamber. And today it'd be like 200, 160 and 40. And it has to pass 2 conventions in a row over different terms. So 1973, 74, and 75, 76, it's got to pass to get on the ballot and become part of the Constitution. So big, massive fight about it. Big, massive fight. And the League of Women Voters, with the support of the Boston Globe and the intense opposition of people in the chamber, passes both times. It passes, it goes on the ballot. I think it was in 1976. It went on the ballot, and then it passed by a relatively easy margin, and then it went on to implementation, and the House had to redraw its maps, so it was only 1 member, 1 district, and 116. It was one of the most excruciatingly difficult processes, painful processes that had ever happened. And it created a massive cultural shift beginning in 1979, when we now had a 160-member House. So much so that I got elected in 1984, And the repercussions of the cut in the size of the house culturally were still living out. And you had just lots of people who were members there who were just really upset at how the place operated. We had a speaker in those days from Lynn. His name was Tommy McGee. He was a former Marine sergeant, and he just he ran the place like a Marine sergeant, and he made so many people pissed off at him that in 1984, his majority leader, a guy named George Coercion from Everett, ran to depose Tom McGee. Unprecedented. Had never happened before, and George Coercion wrapped himself in the mantle of rules reform. I'm going to open up this place. I'm not coming here to be the dictator. I'm coming in here to empower the members to be able to do their best and debate policy. And it was, and he won. Coercion won. I came in 85 and I backed him. My first vote was to elect him as speaker. And it was a revolution. But so I guess the point is that, yes, there's a continuity over 200 years. But then along the way, there are immense monumental battles over whatever, you remember the battles 20 years ago about whether or not gays and lesbians could get married in Massachusetts. And were you there then?
No.
No? Okay. But I was watching. I was a lobbyist then. Just incredible. It turned the whole state upside down. The protests, the marches, the demonstrations inside the building. Every era has those kinds of battles that when they're going on, they feel like the most important thing, and it's going to be the end of civilization, depending upon how it gets settled. And then it gets settled, and then it's on to what the next big battle is. I'm not sure what the big battle is today, though.
Well, I think gay marriage especially shows that even though a lot of the turmoil we're talking about and the tensions we're talking about are internal to Beacon Hill, and internal between the branches, once in a while they do earth-shattering changes in policy. And that's something that spun out of the judiciary, obviously, and then had to be approved by the legislative in one of those constitutional conventions twice. And the second time the ban failed. That's why gay marriage was sustained against an executive who wanted to see it go away. Governor Romney at the time, obviously. So when we talk about budgets and internal warfare and inter-democratic party and interchamber conflict, it's good to remember that these are still the lawmakers and policymakers who are going to handle these titanic issues when culture comes at them with these titanic issues.
Massachusetts is one of 24 states that has a process called initiative and referendum, where citizens can go out and collect signatures to propose a brand new law and get the voters to vote it and then put it on the laws and statutes of the Commonwealth. Or they can do what's called referenda, where the legislature passes a law and then they can collect signatures to put on the ballot whether that law should be repealed. And I recall one episode, this was in 1986, we did a very progressive thing my first year in the legislature. We passed a law mandating seatbelts, mandatory use of seatbelts to every driver. The police could stop you and fine you if you didn't have your seatbelt on. And we had some radio talk show hosts and people. There's a guy named Jerry Williams on WBZ. I think he was on BZ. He just went, but he was a very liberal guy, but he turned conservative, and he just, can I say jihad? He started a jihad against the seatbelt law and just created this uproar. And Howie Carr, the columnist from the Herald, had his own show. And it was, and so for about 12 months, whether or not to mandate the use of seatbelts just became this overwhelming issue that everybody was engaged in. Everybody had an opinion on. It went before the voters, and the voters repealed the law on the ballot. And then I think it was about 4 years later, the legislature passed it again and nothing happened. Jerry Williams had retired. And so, but it's just amazing how, some issues go through, you go out on the street, less than 1 out of 1,000 people know it happens. But then some issues, and sometimes you can't tell what those issues are going to be, takes off and just explodes and has just a catatonic effect on the political culture. Short, long term, hard to say sometimes.
We could have a whole nother discussion about the role initiative petitions and ballot questions play in policymaking in Massachusetts over the last 20 years, certainly. But I kind of wanted to get back to what the status quo on Beacon Hill is right now. Maura Healey is a new governor. She's been in there for a year and some months. She was Attorney General for 8 years prior to that. She's no stranger to the Democratic Party and the workings of the Senate and the House. From your points as observers right now, how do you think she is doing getting her policy across?
Well, I think it's hard, and here's why. And it's the party thing, I wouldn't diminish it, but I wouldn't overstate it. You see it in speaker fights. I don't know if you were there for the Finner and Voke.
Oh, yes.
So because that,
oh, my God.
Perhaps your last year? I don't know where, there was, traditionally, you voted with your party for a nominee for speaker. And typically there was a vote in each of the caucuses, and a guy, Richie Voke, who's the majority leader, was from Chelsea, won the caucus, and most folks, that means he's going to be speaker. Then I want to say Ways and Means Chair Tom Finneran essentially had a discussion made a deal with, depending on who you believe, the Republican caucus, which I think was 34, 35 people at the time, and got 34 Republicans to vote with him to take the speakership. So that is an unusual situation with someone who's clearly viewed as the more conservative of the two Democrats, overcame that opposition in his caucus to become speaker, and became speaker for 8 years or so. So that's part of the dynamic that, again, isn't on paper, but certainly informs a lot of the business. But one thing that I think when any governor comes in, and maybe Charlie Baker's a bit of an exception for a reason I'll explain, is you come in with a statewide mandate or a statewide victory, and you think, all right, I'm the governor, I am the highest elected official here in Massachusetts, and I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and I have that bully pulpit. Well, the legislature, for better or worse, doesn't turn over as frequently as the governor's branch does, and then certainly cabinet secretaries within the executive, even more so. So if you are a Speaker Mariano or a Senate President Spilka, who between the two of them probably have 60 years of legislative experience, when a new person comes in, no matter how talented you are, it's a massive enterprise, and you still have to figure out how you implement policy ideas or things that you talked about on the campaign trail. And they've kind of seen it all, right? And they know the system, they've been in the system, they have a very good understanding of their members and their power. And I think sometimes that is hard for any administration to deal with. That and the reason why I kind of accepted Charlie Baker a little bit, and maybe I'll say this to a certain degree about Governor Weld, who was way before my time. Charlie Baker came in with an awful lot of experience in government. He was the head of HHS, was later head of A&F, the money folks that run the whole system. You can't do those jobs without an intimate understanding of the nuts and bolts of government. And you also have, as a Republican, you have a sense of pretty quickly, all right, I know the playing field here, and I know, hopefully, where I can play ball, where I can push, where I can make deals with legislative leadership, and if you're particularly skillful, recognizing that House versus Senate dynamic, you can play them off against each other potentially to to your benefit. And that, savvy players figure that out pretty quickly. I think that is, I am not a student of history, that's why we have you here. But that is kind of my sense of the dynamic currently, and, over the again, going back to Governor Weld with Paul Cellucci, being a legislative veteran, significant, and then becoming governor in his own right, significant understanding of how the system works. It's hard for anyone to come. It was certainly true of me as mayor. You think, all right, I got the, it's a small town. I've been dealing with a $45 billion budget. We're at, $100 million. But a very wise man who is in leadership said, well, when you got to look for the pile of crap, not exactly, and because there is one, and because you're on the outside, you're not going to know what that is. That is 100% true, and it's something that any new executive has to figure out.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to leave this discussion, seeing how the executive role kind of, in the legislative role as well, functions within that Adams framework that still exists today. Modern politics on top of that 18th century framework. And I think we have a little bit of time for a few questions in the audience.
We do indeed, Mr. Moderator. Any questions, comments, suggestions? Not all at once. Please don't rush me.
Thanks all for being here. The role of staff is really not played into any of tonight's discussion. My question is around both Dr. Shealy's foundational comments as well as your comments on constraining the power of the House with a Senate or with this upper council. During your term, Mayor Broder, there were, I believe, 4 Senate presidents and 1 speaker. You came in through 2, I believe, during your service, while Senator Bulger was Senate President for, I think, the entirety of your service. You had 2 Senate Presidents.
2 Senators, 3 speakers.
Fair enough.
Details.
Both chambers get criticized regularly for a top-down system. But it seems to be that in those eras in which there have been a single speaker or a single president for a long time who wielded a tremendous amount of power, those chambers have reigned supreme on Beacon Hill. Do you think the criticism is apt and well taken, or given the number of people in both chambers, do you suppose that is an essential dynamic of the place?
I think that, so when George Kavarian became Speaker, he had a whole rules reform package. And one of his rules that got the most attention was an 8-year term limit on anybody serving as Speaker. So 4 2-year terms max, up or out. He held to that. His successor, Charlie Flaherty, held to that. And then Tom Finneran, when he became Speaker, used his authority and his power to repeal the term limits. So I think he ended up spending about 10 or so years. I think that term limits for Speaker, and it's been there ever since pretty much. I think the idea of term limits for Speaker and Senate President are absolutely vital and valuable, and something that should be done. I think there was an attempt to try to do it through the ballot initiative, but you can't use the ballot initiative around legislative rules. But so I mean, if there's one thing, there are 2 things that would change. Number 1, term limits for Speaker, and number 2, genuine election by the members of leadership positions, and not the kind of little show trial that we have that is all staged ahead of time and there's no debate or argument at all. Those 2 things would open up the chambers to an immense amount of creativity, and I think those are the kinds of changes that would get away with what we have right now, which is just speakers are basically in charge and they pretty much decide everything.
So a couple of things. The dynamics, I spent almost 10 years, one speaker, longest serving speaker, so a little bit of a different dynamic compared to what you served under, John. And that was the term limit thing has come and gone. That is for sure. It got reinserted by Speaker DeLeo, by the membership, I should say. It got eliminated by the membership, and the Senate just ended the term limit as Senate President Spilka is coming up on her 8 years. One thing, and I'd love to get your insight on this, because from the outside looking in, I remember there was that McGee versus Finneran fight, and I'm sorry, right, that fight, and no, I'm thinking about when Kavarian
84.
beat McGee on a reform package, and that was very responsive to the dynamic at the time. You fast forward to post 88, the Massachusetts miracle ends, and the Massachusetts state government was seen to be in some disarray, and one of the complaints, as an observer, was Kavarian's a bum, he can't control his membership, he can't move things. So I think there's always a little bit of an interesting dynamic around that. Like we very much have a results perspective. And by that I mean to make a very complicated story probably unfairly condensed, when Tom Finneran ran into trouble, liberals, progressives were delighted for reasons that I think are very fair and make sense. When Speaker DeMacy got into trouble, a lot of progressives and liberals were heartbroken because, well, what Speaker DeMacy ultimately got convicted of was kind of a classic graft, quite frankly. They were looking at his policies, his results. You can make an argument that he saved gay marriage in the Commonwealth, that he was willing to move on progressive things that Speaker Finneran would never move on. And that's always a challenge. When I was in the legislature, one of the challenging things for some folks that we did was voted on extending civil rights protections in public accommodations to the transgender community. I suspect if that was left to the membership as a so-called vote of conscience, then it wouldn't have passed by a veto-proof margin like it did, because leadership put its shoulder behind it. And one thing I do think that we forget is it is still a government of people. Like, there are you have that power as an elected. I'm not naive enough to say that it is equal power. It doesn't mean you'll be successful in changing policy, but you can certainly push back in whatever way is available to you under the rules, and with social media in particular, both inside and outside the building. I do think that some folks confuse tweeting with governing, which is not the best thing, certainly in the world. But I do think folks keep that in mind. There was a gentleman that served in the legislature. Was it Chris Hodgkins?
He served in the legislature.
He served in the legislature, and he was that representative who stood up to Finneran. Did he get a lot of policy victories? No, but he certainly had and exercised that power, and I hope I have the right name. So, at the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the elected to do what he or she thinks is right, and that can be defined a million ways.
Yeah, so a few statements, but mostly questions after. So I've been involved working mostly with the executive branch on different issues, although I was very involved with the transgender policy where the somewhat not enthusiastic vote that made it pass was also opposed by a referendum ticket, which then we won by 70%. So it was a tricky thing to do. I found that new governors, especially if they're not super experienced, like Governor Weld was, so I've worked pretty much from the end of Dukakis administration on for like 40 years maybe, with different parts of the government. And at one point, actually, under Weld, the first year, he didn't have people that were, he appointed people he thought would be best for the job, which was an interesting thing to do because that's not usually how it works. And they got lost after 2 years, but it worked pretty well for a while. So some of my issues, all of a sudden, I was writing the bicycle plan for the state of Massachusetts because his staff person said do that. But then the Secretary of Transportation got changed. They changed, or Secretary of Public Works, whatever, the Public Works Department got changed to the Highway Department, and things that weren't cars and trucks went away for a while, like 10 years. But I'm wondering how much the leadership in the legislature changed over the previous 2 centuries. How much there was a constancy of leadership the way there has been more recently, whether people changed more frequently as the legislature changed more frequently, or did it back into the 19th century and the 18th.
I probably can't answer for the 19th century. I can say in the decades on either side of independence, speakership is strong, but there's an additional institution which is, and I think it has to do with the challenges of transportation and communication in the early American period. Boston is the seat of the House, right? And the Boston delegation is here at all times, but the legislature is in session twice a year. And the Boston delegation is sitting here planning, and often, but not always, the speaker is a member of the 4-person Boston delegation. At that time, Boston gets 4 representatives. The other towns, except for Salem, get 2. But it's sort of like Madison showing up at the Constitutional Convention with a plan in hand, and then everybody has to work off that, right? So the Boston bench sat front and center in the House, always had the plan, and essentially set the agenda for the entire session. So those 4 representatives tended to hold power that was greater than other members of the House. I do think that evolves significantly over the 19th century and into the 20th century.
An anecdote that's really probably not germane to the long history, but when I came in with David, there was tremendous turnover in the House. Roughly a quarter of the membership flipped, and there were more Republicans, I think it was by 1, or whatever, there were more Republicans than Democrats in our class, which was a very unusual thing. It meant that, they had a much bigger slice of the membership than they had in terms of recent history. And, reflecting back on Governor Weld, one thing that Governor Weld had when he first came in was a veto-proof majority in the Senate, which was, and that helped him in terms of the leverage of that dynamic. He lost it pretty quickly, or I shouldn't say he, but that turned pretty quickly. But that's a circumstance that certainly mattered for him.
Thank you, Mayor Broder. And on behalf of Revolutionary Spaces, thank you to our panelists and our audience. And a special thank you to the Lowell Institute for supporting this event, and much thanks to our media partner, the GBH Forum Network. Thanks too to Representative David Vieira for joining us this evening. We appreciate that, Representative. We hope this evening's program will inspire you to return for a daytime visit to see our museums and exhibits, and perhaps an evening visit for a future public program. Next up in that regard is Your Voice in This House, Taking a Civic Leap on Thursday, May 23rd, right here at Old South. To learn more about Revolutionary Spaces, follow us on social media at Rev Spaces, and check us out at revolutionaryspaces.org. Once again, thank you very much, and good evening to all.